Dupre. I am currently living in Marine on St. Croix, but spent 20 years in Emerald, Wisconsin. You can see in the upper left-hand corner here was the 20-acre hobby farm my husband and I lived at for 20 years. And when we first moved there, it was nice out in the open. And then about 4 years after we moved there, Emerald Dairy decided to build a brand new structure from the ground up, about 1.5 miles down the road from us. And so even though there was quite a bit of community resistance to that, this is a very heavily populated rural area. There's like 90 families within a 2-mile radius of this facility. DNR assured us that everything would be fine and we wouldn't have anything to worry about. Well, as you'll see, that didn't quite turn out to be that way. But let's start at the wide angle. Milk production by state, you'll see there the two big dots in Wisconsin and California. Those are the two major producers of milk products. So it's no surprise that we have a lot of dairy in Wisconsin. But what we have noticed in the past 20 years is the concentration of that dairy. While the number of cows has stayed pretty much the same, the number of family farms, or farms in general, if you want to call them that, the number of production facilities, shall we say, has shrunk from about 16,000 in 2022 down to 5,300 in 2024. And you'll see on the map here, it grows more and more purple, not because this is a political purple state, even though it is, but because of its severe concentration of mega dairies in the region. So this is a map of all of the CAFOs in Wisconsin. Now, this is also not just dairy, but turkey or beef or chicken or hog. But let's just say the vast majority of this belongs to the dairy industry. There's about 345 of these throughout the entire state of Wisconsin, which sounds like a lot to you and me, but when you compare it to the 8,000 in Iowa, that is not very many, but they do have a very big impact. There's only 15 DNR CAFO staff that are overseeing all 345 of these facilities and making sure that they are abiding by what few regulations we do have. And we don't include on this map what we call affectionately the 980 Club, which are those entities that are just under the 1,000 animal unit benchmark where DNR says you have to have permits by us now. If you're below that benchmark, it's pretty much open season. And so that doesn't include a lot of those farms, and there are many of those. That seems to be the industry trend, whether you're in Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, wherever, is that if you don't want to have to be accountable, you just stay right underneath that benchmark, whatever it is for that state. And we'll point out here too that the source of 90% of phosphorus and nitrogen that are polluting our waterways, and this is at a local level, at a statewide level, at a national level, the research shows that it's due to agricultural activity. So even though there's a lot of skepticism by the industry, by blaming septic systems, golf courses, people who put too much fertilizer on their yard, it's not the size, the footprint is not the size to have that kind of an impact. So, and how we actually thought we could measure this and get some people's head wrapped around it is this map of the St. Croix River watershed, which you'll see in the upper left-hand corner. That's the border between Minnesota and Wisconsin, where we all live here. And this is actually a human equivalent of the number of cows or livestock in general in each of these sub-watersheds of the whole St. Croix River watershed. So you'll notice on the one that says 2.269 million, that's like having an extra 2.2 million people just in those, 3.5 counties in the entire that have, as far as waste goes, that is not treated. And that is what the livestock represents, is an extra 2.2 million people in that. We had Dr. Jones out of the University of Iowa do this map for us. He's done also the Great Lakes region over in Michigan and eastern Wisconsin. So he says this helps people understand how much extra waste you are having to deal with on the landscape when you put it in a human equivalent. And if you remember your map from the other side, or previously, the other side of the state in eastern Wisconsin is really heavy in as far as CAFOs go. And Lee Luff came and spoke to one of our committee meetings, and 80% of their farms supposedly have these nutrient management plans that the DNR promises will help keep your water clean and help keep your way of life and all this sort of stuff. But actually, a nutrient management plan is just that. It is a plan. It's not actuals. And so you'll see that the city of Green Bay here is struggling with keeping enough clean drinking water available for their residents, according to this article, because of all the nutrient pollution coming from the farms downstream into their water treatment plant. And they were having to spend a lot of extra money and charge the city residents a lot of extra money in order to clean up the water so that they could drink it. And that's the unfortunate part, is that there's too many of the producers that are able to pass off the costs of doing business onto other people. And that's where, in my mind, it doesn't turn out very fair. You'll notice in the lower left-hand corner, those are the way the barns look nowadays. That's not how most people have envisioned barns. They've envisioned the nice little red thing and cows in the pasture, but you will never see cows out on the pasture in these type of facilities. These are the size of airport hangars and Amazon warehouses. And the cows stay inside the whole time. Never see a blade of grass. Let's put it that way. And so I think a lot of people have the misconception, even here locally, the DNR's got this covered. That's their wheelhouse. They've got it under control. But what a lot of folks don't realize is that the DNR permitting process only deals with water and water discharging into waters of the state. So the CAFO waste storage and the self-spreading is all self-monitored, and violations are self-reported. Which that means, would you turn yourself in if you were speeding? Of course not. So this, and you'll see here in a little while why this is such a problem. DNR permits also do not require any air pollution controls. They don't require any biosecurity plans, which when avian flu has started spreading to dairy cows, that was a problem. There are no controls for any mass casualty events, whether that's caused by an infectious disease or subsequent carcass disposal because of like a fire or any other kinds of disasters, a tornado. There's no plan to how to deal with all the dead animals. DNR also does not look at fire plans. Even those barns are a quarter-mile long, there's no fire plans or water use plans required by DNR. And all the heavy trucks that go running around the countryside on those little country roads, there's no requirement by DNR that the roads be a certain weight or certain, standard to hold up to the wear and tear. And of course, there's no property valuation analysis required for local homeowners. So that's the unfortunate part, is that homeowners have taken a back seat in this process. One of the big issues is nitrate, and I share this simply because this is the report to the legislature for this year on how much nitrate is affecting and polluting the waterways in Wisconsin. But yet, this is the same thing that's been said for probably 20 years on the same report to the same legislature. Nothing has changed. As far as rules, regulations, this is not new information. This is old information. I mean, it's current, but this is not some kind of surprise. And as a result, this is southern Door County. Door County is one of the most touristy places in the state of Wisconsin, known for its cherry orchards and for its scenic views of Lake Michigan. just northeast of Green Bay. This is the month of May, and it's already green with slime and algae, which that is highly unusual for things to be that polluted that early. A lot of times the lakes in Wisconsin, it takes until mid-June maybe, but this was quite early. And so that's the unfortunate part in that, there's a heavy tourist industry in Door County, as there are in many places in Wisconsin. And so when this runoff, a field runoff, ends up in the waters and causes this, obviously it really reduces the number of people. I've heard people from Wisconsin complain, I'm tired of fishing in the Green Lakes, And this dead zone, I mean, this eutrophication goes all the way down to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, about the size of New Jersey, they say. But it's not getting smaller, let's put it that way. This is Emerald Sky Dairy from 2017 pictures. This was the one that was 1.5 miles from my house. You'll notice the barns up in the upper left-hand corner, the lagoon right next to them that's got a big cover on it. You'll notice another cow barn down toward the bottom of the picture, along with a couple rows of little houses. Those are where the calves were at. And then the stormwater pond on the far right-hand side. And so what happened when the spill happened was that a hose had broken between the barns and the lagoon, and it had run down into these wetland areas all the way down here into the stormwater pond, which had a discharge valve into this huge wetland here. So this area between the two red lines is the big wetland, and you can see it looks like it's full of manure. Now this spill happened, they said it happened in December, and they didn't notice it for 10 days until somebody saw some like 3 feet full of waste running down the ditch toward the back of the property, that stormwater pond. And then they realized, oh, we had a valve break. It was winter, it had gotten cold. They think something froze and busted. So they called the repairman who came out and repaired it, but they didn't call the DNR like they were supposed to. They were supposed to self-report. When you have an issue, you're supposed to call DNR and self-report. That didn't happen. They went ahead and fixed it and went on. And it wasn't until about 100 days later when we got an anonymous tip that something happened over at the dairy, something big, and nobody's talking about it. So DNR was called, the local county was called, and they went on site, and this is what they found, these pictures here. That is a wetland by the boot there, and the yardstick won't even touch the bottom. There was that much manure in that wetland. And the one on the right is the stormwater pond. That was the water coming out of the stormwater pond at the time. And then you'll see, obviously, the person there walking through the wetland and up to his boots, top of his boots practically in manure. You'll see a pile there on the lower left of animal bones that were obviously discarded. They weren't properly dealt with. And you also notice the top picture there, that's the stormwater pond. And you'll see all the manure floating off to the side. So not only do you see a lot of this on the surface in your surface waters, but it also affects your soil when you overspread and when things like this pile up over time. According to University of Wisconsin, if you have phosphorus levels in your fields, according to your soil test, of like 35 parts per million or larger, you have excessive phosphorus, which is likely to run off into your surface waters. So these are the fields that were right around Emerald Sky Dairy, and you'll notice that all of them are above 35. Some of them are double that, some of them are triple that or more. And it takes years for the phosphorus to work its way out of the soil. And that's if you spread no other manure or any other fertilizer that has phosphorus in it on top of it. So, and the more phosphorus you have on your field, the more it'll hold some, but the more likely it is to run off into your surface waters. Now, when it comes to wildlife, this is the report. I call this the Captain Obvious moment. This was written by the DNR wetland specialist after the spill at Emerald Sky. And you'll notice I highlighted a couple things here that he put in his report. Several feet of manure, in my opinion, is not a suitable habitat for all life stages of aquatic organisms. Go figure. He also wrote that all habitat is almost entirely lost when the wetland surface is replaced by fill. And manure is not a typical amphibian breeding habitat. More Captain Obvious noted. But I'm glad he made those notes. At least we have something on the record about how he felt and how he viewed the situation. Well, you would think that if after a terrible thing like that happening, the owner would probably be a little more careful and realize that maybe he should watch his P's and Q's. Well, that didn't happen because 2 years later, we had a fish kill, again, because they were spreading in December on semi-frozen ground, and it ran off into a ditch. And when there happened to be a sheriff's deputy that just drove by and saw this huge brown flow of stuff headed downstream, and he saw that it was ending up in the creek. So he called the DNR on that and got the wheels going. They ended up with a $65,000 fine on this one. The previous one should have been that previous massive spill that was 275,000 gallons. And I think that was probably the largest spill in state history when you include the cleanup, because a lot of that manure ended up in the stormwater pond. And they had to empty that 4 million gallon stormwater pond twice and spread it on area fields. And then they had to remove all the manure from the wetlands. And that was 3,400 tons of manure that was out spread on the fields. And I was living there at the time, and one of the fields that they were using was kitty cornered from my house. And I watched the manure trucks flip by my house for 3 days straight, 10 hours a day, every 15 minutes, going back and forth like bees in a beehive on the same field, with spreading the manure that was coming from all of that mess. So it was a lot of overspreading. And then there was an E. coli outbreak in some homes just to the south and southwest of myself, just downstream from where they had been spreading like that. So it was a tough road. The sad part is that when it comes to CAFOs, air pollution isn't really required to be monitored even. And that's kind of been my beef with the whole thing, is that when bad things happen, I think the area residents should be notified. They have a right to know that their water or their air could be contaminated. And that's not how this federal court sees it. This was a recent decision, and they are not requiring, the large environmental or the large livestock farms to do these environmental testing and tracking of even just the air pollution, because that will come back to haunt folks, who are sensitive, especially if you downwind of this. That's a huge concern with air pollution from CAFOs. So, and there I could get into all the ammonia, the nitrous oxide and all that too, but let's just say it's not good. And I remember times, even on good days when it wasn't around the spill, I couldn't have my windows open at home because I couldn't breathe the air. It was more of an ammonia smell. It was not what I remember when I was a kid on the farm. I mean, manure is one smell, but this stuff had been cooking in a lagoon for 6 months, and it had gotten a real ammonia smell. And that's the kind of stuff that burns your throat and burns your eyes. And so you would have to stay in the house on usually one of the best days, because that's when they were out spreading. That was the unfortunate part. So what I have found during all of my advocacy work and talking with folks is that a lot of people don't understand what the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act actually cover. Worst off, private wells are not protected under the Clean Water Act or the Safe Drinking Water Act. Only municipal public wells are covered under that. And it also does not apply to groundwater. So it only applies to surface water. And the reason for that was this picture here on the left-hand side. This is what was shown to Congress back in 1972. There was a big debate amongst experts at the time well, this green stuff in our lakes, where's that coming from? And everybody had an opinion. So they decided to do an experiment. And then they put a curtain in this lake there in Canada. On one side of the curtain, they dumped a bunch of nitrogen. On the other side of the curtain, they dumped a bunch of phosphorus. Well, the side with the phosphorus is what turned the lake green. So that's what they emphasized when they wrote the Clean Water Act. They weren't as concerned about the nitrates. They were more concerned about the phosphorus and the runoff and turning your lakes green. The other thing folks don't realize is that it doesn't really apply to agriculture unless there's a point source, unless there's a tube coming out of the barn, which that's not usually where a lot of these spills happen. They happen on the field with the spreading, and either rain or snow or overspreading is what ends up getting all this stuff into our waters. And so Clean Water Act does not deal with that at all. And Iowa is the king of nitrates. You know, even though nitrates don't turn your lake green, they are still a big health hazard. They have the second highest and the fastest growing cancer rate in the US right now. And they feel that manure from CAFOs is one of the main reasons for that. And there's all kinds of adult carcinogens, you know, that are also in the water when there's high nitrates. There's a high cancer rate even amongst adults. It's not just that's the other thing. I hear a lot of farmers say it's not a blue baby. It's just a blue baby thing. It's just a mother and small children thing. No, it's not. Nitrates is a lot more than that nowadays. So people wonder, well, why don't you sue them? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And believe me, I've talked to a lot of lawyers. And it really boils down to all these right to farm laws that a lot of the Midwestern states have, a lot of states have, but especially those in the Midwest. And we kind of nicknamed them the right to harm laws, simply because, you know, the agriculture is such weight in our country and in our culture. It's really hard to get any kind of laws through. I mean, originally these laws were meant to protect the farmer from urban sprawl and somebody building a McMansion out by the farm and complaining about the farmer driving his tractor down the road. But now the tables have kind of flipped, and these now are protecting the CAFOs. And unless you can prove that your water got contaminated based on my action and you can trace it to thy farm, then you might have a case, but otherwise you don't. And when it's E. coli, you can trace it back to a farm, actually. You can trace it almost back to a cow based on the antibiotic markers in an E. coli and a bacteria. But when you're dealing with nitrates, nitrate changes form so often and so quickly, it's really hard to trace that. There is some testing out there that tries to trace it back to either manure or fertilizer, but that has not really caught hold. So I find it interesting, the conflict on the farms here with the tourism industry, because actually the tourism industry, like I was talking in Door County earlier, provides more jobs than agriculture does. And so there's this constant push-pull between those two industries as to, well, who's going to make the rules here? You know, the farmers want to do it one way. They want the status quo, you know, the industry, I should say. They want the status quo, but the tourism says, well, we can't sell hotel rooms if people can't drink the water. So, as far as social justice issues, we have in Wisconsin something that's called ALICE. It's an asset limited, income constrained, employed households with income above the federal poverty level, but less than the basic cost of living in their county. So that's kind of our measurement there. And you'll notice here I have this map. The little blue squares indicate the number of households that are challenged financially. The darker the blue, the more households that are in that area that are challenged financially. The little red triangles are the CAFOs, and the little yellow squares are all the fields they spread on. And you'll notice in St. Croix County, wherever the blue gets darker, there's more spreading fields and there's more CAFOs. So they deliberately target, you know, the smaller townships. These are populations of maybe 200 to 400 people in each of these townships. A lot of times the CAFO owner sits on the town board. And they don't have a lot of money to fight off the big deep pockets that industrial ag has, especially the Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce and also the Dairy Business Association. So that's what makes it tough for folks, and why a lot of times they just say, well, forget it, you know. We have seen some success with our indigenous neighbors, and that's because the Treaty of 1855. I took some tree medicine classes from a Lakota medicine man a couple years ago, so I got a real firsthand account into indigenous culture. And he was always emphasizing how their culture sees themselves as a people, as brothers and sisters with plants and animals. They see themselves as equals. They don't see themselves at the top of the pyramid or top of the food chain. Everything is lateral. That's the first big thing I've noticed. And this treaty helped them when they did the ceded territory. It gave them still hunting and fishing rights and some control over that land. Whereas, you know, a lot of times, you know, those of us who are European descent, we can't, like, even though it's our private property, we're not a sovereign nation. We're underneath the American government. So there was a big CAFO up in northern Minnesota that tried to go in next to the White Earth Reservation there. And when they found out that a lot of these spreading fields were going to be in their ceded territory, well, this was going to affect their way of life. This was going to contaminate their water. They grow wild rice. That's how a lot of them support themselves. They go through the wetlands with a canoe, 2 people on it. One person's paddling, the other person, when it's harvest time, hits the top of the grass and the wild rice falls down into the boat. And that's how they gather their wild rice, and that's what they use to support themselves, and they eat it for themselves too. The fish are sacred as well. And so it was refreshing to hear that there is some pushback. The courts have been holding up this 1855 treaty, in essence. They have held that up and said these are sovereign people with a sovereign nation, and you can't contaminate their waters. Socially Responsible Ag Project has also been working with the tribes in northern Wisconsin. And so they are also starting to pursue the operational ordinances, which we've been doing a lot of in our areas. And those basically entail that it's not a ban, because you can't do that statewide. It's against the law to ban a CAFO. But if you're going to come here and put up a facility like that, you're going to play by our rules. You're not going to play by your rules. So we can have all those things that DNR said I said DNR didn't cover. Those are the kinds of things the townships can cover. They can do fire plans. They can do road wear and tear. They can do a biosecurity plan. They can do all this stuff that DNR doesn't cover in their township ordinance and hold those large farms to it. And this is the same thing that these indigenous folks in Wisconsin now are starting to pick up on as well. And theirs can hold weight a lot easier than ours, simply because they are a sovereign nation. Well, of course, I think everybody knows what Citizens United is, and the proliferation of monies into our political system. Dairy has a lot of that. There's a lot to money to go around and be spent in lobbying and making sure the status quo remains the status quo. And of course, our top dairy lobbying clients probably are no surprise: Land O'Lakes, National Milk Producers, International Dairy Foods, Dairy Farmers of America. These are all folks that carry a lot of weight when you get into the halls of Congress. But we also know that people can hold a lot of weight as well. And this is where Sustain Rural Wisconsin has been doing a lot of work. We've kind of gone hyper local with these operational ordinances and getting folks protected from these animal factories, so to speak. Because we've learned that you can't out message what people are experiencing in their daily life. And so Sam and Ty here, the one in the upper left, she was sick, nauseous, throwing up, every day for 4 years. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with her until somebody told her, have you ever checked your water? And she lived between two CAFOs. And when she checked her water, she saw it was really high in nitrates. And once she put in a reverse osmosis system, things got a lot better. And so it's that type of thing that what we want to protect people, public health and safety. We would love it if our government would use the precautionary principle that if you're uncertain of an impact something would have on your community, you won't proceed until you're certain, rather than putting that burden of proof back on the citizens to prove that the producer did something wrong. So people power can help as well. This is Nature Energy was one of the biogas, and we'll switch over to biogas a little bit here. One of the biogas companies out of Denmark that was trying to set up shop in St. Croix County. And this was more of a community digester where they were going to be bringing manure and food waste and a whole bunch of stuff from different areas. And most of it was outside of the county. But the catch was when you get the methane into the tubes and into the pipeline and off to California, the digestate left over is very high in nitrogen and very high in phosphorus. And that's what they wanted to give back to the farmers to spread on their fields. Well, the farmers said, all this stuff is coming in from outside the county, and you're basically turning my farm field into a dumping ground. You know, it's not going back to where it came from. And I thought that was the deal, they said. And they said, besides, I don't want this stuff if I don't know what's in it. And I don't want this stuff if it doesn't give me what I want for my crops, if it doesn't help my crops do well. And so there was a lot of pushback in St. Croix County in Wisconsin there, just outside the Twin Cities. And they left. Finally, Nature Energy said, well, you know what? After 4 years, we're done. It was a little bit of a battle, but people power does work. So on to biogas per se. You'll see here the orange lines. These are all the pipelines in Wisconsin. And the little circles, those are the CAFOs. So you'll see how much they align. And I loved one of the editorials I read, even in one of the farm papers, that said, well, if you start making money off your pollution, you're not going to stop polluting, right? And a lot of the farmers were joking that, well, we could make more money off the manure than we could the milk. So that does seem like a little backwards in my mind, is that if you're going to do that, you shouldn't be making a whole ton of money, more money off the manure. CAFOs do contribute a significant amount of methane, which obviously is a huge concern for the climate. But what I think a lot of folks forget is that the cow itself, most of the methane it emits is the enteric fermentation kind, the burps and the farts, so to speak. And that's mainly just from beef and dairy. And dairy is probably the worst because lactating cows, it's always a lot higher. And so no matter what you do with the manure, it's going to pale in comparison to the burps and the farts. And you'll see that Wisconsin has been targeted as one of the most prime areas for biogas development because of the dairy. Dairy has a lot of liquid in it. And that's why it doesn't need a lot of extra water. I've talked with folks in Tennessee who were doing poultry. Somebody was trying to bring a biogas digester in there for the poultry manure. And the catch is poultry manure is a lot drier. And so they were having to use a lot of groundwater, and that was a threat to the city drinking water. Where dairy is a different situation. And that's why I think California and Wisconsin are targeted, because all you need is the manure and other stuff. You don't need a lot of groundwater or river water. And of course, it didn't help when the federal government started throwing a lot of money at the biogas digester industry under the guise of it being, clean energy. This has been the big concern in our area, in the sense that if you have that marriage of big energy and big ag, that's going to be a little scary, because then if that biogas that's made from cow manure is getting dependent America is getting dependent on that for their public transportation or cars or whatever, it's going to be really hard to reverse that going forward. That's the huge concern. But the energy companies and, is already pairing up, like Chevron is partnering with California Bioenergy. Duke Energy is partnering up with Smithfield. They're trying to partner up ahead of time so that they can capitalize. You'll see the dark brown lines on 2022 and 2023, the amount of money that's being thrown at these types of things. And unfortunately, the Trump administration has decided to extend these tax credits and tax breaks to these large-scale manure digesters through 2029, and even weakens the emission calculations that make the waste appear less harmful. And no matter how much you do for the industry, you'll notice that the American Biogas Council still wants more. We didn't get enough. We didn't get enough tax credits. We didn't get enough handouts. We want more. So, and on its front, it sounds like, a good deal in the sense that, well, we're reusing our waste. We're doing what Mother Nature does. And it's like, not really. First off, composting and anaerobic digestion are not the same. Composting uses oxygen, and that helps control the methane, whereas the anaerobic digestion does not use oxygen, and you get a very different process in the making there. I tell people to be, if you need an elevator speech, to be worried about the 3 Ps, the pathogens, the PFAS, and the plastics. The pathogens mainly, and this is the thing that really set me off originally, was that when I'm composting, and I'm a master gardener and I teach composting, if you're going to put stuff in your compost pile, it should be at least 130 to 150 degrees for several days in order to kill the pathogens before you put it on, especially a food garden. If you want to put it around your flowers, probably not as worried about it. But however, in this world, in the biodigester world, that costs a lot of money to heat it up to that much heat for that long. And so they would rather heat it at a lower temperature, like 100 or 86 to 104. And that way they get more methane and they spend less on the heat. So that's a good deal for them. But it doesn't kill hardly, as many of the pathogens. And then when they start spraying the pathogen liquid water out over the landscape and it catches in the wind and goes downwind, that's the worrisome part, in my humble opinion. That's really worrisome. PFAS are those forever chemicals. I don't know if you've heard a lot about those out east. We hear about them all the time in Minnesota because of 3M. So obviously that's a big concern. And the plastics, because a lot of the equipment nowadays is kind of older equipment. When they're taking the used food and depackaging it, they're not getting very good results from that, because there tends to be a lot more plastics that end up in that biodigestate than there should be. And so let's see. And the other big concern I tell folks to worry about is the lack of regulation. And I know this firsthand because when I went to one of the meetings on the biodigester in New Richmond, Wisconsin, I talked to the guy from Denmark for like a half an hour, peppering him with questions, and he was peppering me with questions. And I came down and I asked him, I said, tell me, once you have your facility up and running, who's really overseeing your day-to-day operations? And he looked at me, oh, it's all about trust. Trust between you and us, that's all. Just trust. It's like, well, that tells me there isn't much regulation. And this is why I think a lot of these companies that have chemicals that are hard to get rid of because of their toxicity, wanting to mix it with manure so they can get the farm exemption. And so you'll see this chart done by Dr. Sarah D'Onofrio. She's done her PhD thesis paper on biogas in Wisconsin. If you need a good read, there's one for you. But you'll notice that on farm, there's hardly any testing of any substance other than nitrogen and phosphorus. If this was a landfill, in the middle column, you'll see how much more testing is required. And if this was a wastewater treatment plant, which this is what they like to say. Well, this is just like the wastewater. We have biodigesters all the time here. It's like, well, the ones on the farm are not regulated like the ones in town. And you'll see the difference in the type of things that are tested and how often they're tested. So those are the 3 Ps, the pathogens, the PFAS, and the plastics, and the amount of regulation. And here's another chart that talks about that. You'll see at the top, those are the advantages of an anaerobic digestate system, supposedly, how it takes organic waste, goes through the process, and then you have digestate, and you do have some environmental impact here, soil contamination, water pollution, crop health risks, depends on what's in the digestate. I call it the soup of the day, because they don't always get the same thing from the same people, you know? And so it could be anything in there. And that's why the farmers were saying, yeah, no, thank you. And you'll notice down in the lower left, this is what I was really questioning the guy from Denmark on. Nutrient oversupply. There's a lot of cases where there's overspreading being done here in the United States of manure on land. And there's been felony charges filed in Kewaunee County in Wisconsin, actually, over stuff like this. You'll notice the USA really has just some guidelines, but we have no strict limits of that kind. You look at the UK, the EU, and Germany. And this is what the guy from Denmark was telling me when I asked him about overspreading. He said, well, we give you back what you gave us. It's a reduced amount. It's highly concentrated. And that is all you get. You don't get anything else. And if you go out somewhere else and try to get extra fertilizer to throw on your field, we cut you off our program. You're done. So they really tightly regulated in Denmark anyway, as far as how much fertilizer gets used, so that you don't have that overspreading, and then you don't have the runoff going on. And then you'll notice under antibiotic and resistant genes, nobody is reporting on that when it's in digestate. Microplastics, nobody's reporting on that when it's in digestate. And even if there's other kinds of pollutants like PFAS, the UK, the USA, and China don't report on that. So that's the other thing I tell folks, is that it's a regulation problem a lot in my mind as well. So California was the one that was kind of leading the charge on all of this originally. They've invested over $600 million to construct all these digesters, and yet they only get $68 worth of methane. But it costs them $294 on average to capture that methane from the cow manure. So obviously you're behind the 8 ball on that right away. And the subsidies they were getting from the government was over $1,900 per cow per year. So you can see why these guys went after these facilities. I mean, they are not cheap things to build. They're like $1 million or more. And they required that the methane gas be purchased by the utilities. So this is how the whole thing started. Now, I've heard that because natural gas because the Trump administration's got the drill baby drill mantra, that has thrown a monkey wrench into some of the markets here. So we'll see how that plays out. But they're still looking for as many credits as they can get. Let's put it that way. Oops, there we go. And then the other kicker for this, and Sustained Rural Wisconsin Network, which I'm part of, I'm not working on this report. Lisa Dorr is working on this report, but she's been investigating, follow the money. How do these things get financed? These things are huge, money-wise, physically, in every way. And what we're finding out is a lot of this stuff is being financed with public funds, municipal bonds, other types of public monies. And this is the thing I find very ironic, is that when the developer wants to build a digester, he goes to the bank or whoever, the credit agency, and says, I have solid waste. I'm trying to get rid of solid waste. I qualify for taxpayer municipal bonds or whatever. And then he walks down the road to the DNR, and it comes time to look at permits that he might need. Well, this is manure. This isn't solid waste. This is manure. I can use the farm exemptions for all these things. And so That's the irony behind this. And then come to find out, a lot of these biogas things don't produce the kind of gas, the amounts of gas that you would think. It would be, they flare a lot of it off, which is even worse for the methane issue. And, or they just don't have the staff. I mean, these things can explode. They kill people. Actually, I mean, people who go in and clean out the digester have died from asphyxiation. I mean, there's all kinds of issues besides the smell and the traffic and all that kind of stuff. So Sustainable Wisconsin is digging deeper into where's the money coming from on all these things. And we're coming up, you know, they're filing for bankruptcy. They're not the wonderful investment you think they are. Let's put it that way. So we're hoping if we get that word out, a lot less people will be interested in funding them. This is our cheat sheet, I like to call it, for factory farms and factory farm gas. For folks who don't know much about it, it kind of gives you the highlights. There are manure-only digesters out there, and those are usually farm-centered, and they usually use the heat and use the digester, the methane to generate heat and electricity for their farm in and of itself. It's not this community thing where it's pulling in stuff from everywhere else. And I do have some concerns over those still because of the concentration of the nutrients. But the co-digesters seem to be a lot more of the popular thing right now that's going after a lot of funding and trying to bring in that toxic waste, mixing it with manure so it can go on a farm field. And if you're growing food on that field, that's putting all that stuff in our food supply. So that's worrisome as well. Anyways. So yeah, we have lots. Here's just a few articles that talk about the Emerald Dairy had a digester to start with. And that was 25 years ago, actually. And after wasn't even 2 years, it kind of blew up. Those things are it's a chemical reaction. It's a chemical soup, basically. And if you got a little too much of one thing and not enough of another, you're not going to have a good end result. That's the other concerning issue. Obviously, there's the smell issue and the fact that if we're not enforcing regulations on CAFOs, why would anybody think that we're going to enforce them on a digester? I just don't see that as being a good end result. Well, I'll just touch a little bit on like the Farm Bill here. Part of the issue, obviously, is the Farm Bill. The most of it goes for nutrition, which is SNAP. But the majority of subsidies in the Farm Bill, that's just done every 5 to 7 years or so, it goes to soybeans, corn, cotton, wheat, and rice. Well, soybeans and corn are to feed the animals, you know, and cotton, wheat, and rice are for the rest of us, so to speak. And there aren't very many subsidies for specialty crops or for food we actually eat. Fruits, nuts, vegetables, other nursery crops. That's kind of the irony of the thing. You know, it's very geared toward one type of system. And these crop insurance subsidies, these subsidies are mainly crop insurance. It's usually a 60-40 split where the government's paying 60% of the premium for the crop insurance in case there's drought, excess moisture, hail, heat, or freeze. And then the farmer's paying the other 40%. But the other ironic thing is that this crop insurance is paying the farmers billions of dollars for weather-related losses that are closely linked to, obviously, our climate issues. So that's the other thing I'll touch on is corporate consolidation. There are 10 companies basically in charge of the majority of our food. And here's a map that's probably way too small for anybody to see, but you'll get the point. Tyson is really the big dog in the meat sector, Cargill in the grain sector, PepsiCo in the beverages, Dairy Farmers of America in the dairy. And when food monopolies are really the big game in town, they can impact grocery prices because without as very much competition, they can set the price to whatever they want. And that's why we're seeing so much inflation going on, actually. We don't have enough real competition in the market. And so here's another way of looking at this, that this is how much of our food market is controlled by only 4 corporations, whether you're talking cottonseed, fertilizer, corn seed, retail grocery, pork processing, beef processing, agriculture, machinery even. And it's just amazing the contracts that people are getting tied up in. It used to be an independent farmer making his decisions as to what he plants, how he plants it, when he plants it, and now he's basically a sharecropper being told how to operate his farm. And he's the one going into debt for a lot of the buildings on these CAFOs, where the company is having a lot less risk and money involved. They might supply the food, they supply the animals, but the farmer's taking the majority of the risk. And that's kind of backwards in my humble opinion. So, and dairy has consolidated quite a bit. Actually, it was one of the last ones to do this. The whole CAFO model got started. I think you heard from the gal from North Carolina. You know, she talked about how the CAFO model started with like the hogs and the chickens out there. And that was very true. That's and it has spread to be other animals. And dairy is one of the last to do that, to go down that road. And that's why their concentration has been, their consolidation has been speeding up really fast. And the antitrust issues to me are the biggest issue. The antitrust laws that were in the 30s, the 1930s that were passed, they're pretty much toothless now, which is unfortunate. Obviously the impact on the farms, you know, you're having all these bigger farms, and that's bigger environmental. It's hard to handle that much manure in a small area. One of our consultants tells us that back in the day, when you talk about the regular family farm, like in the 70s, there was like 200 acres and you had 3 to 4 acres per cow to spread any kind of manure. Well, nowadays the DNR is requiring less than 1 for a lot of these places. And then we wonder why we're having issues with our water quality. So, yeah, so I'll end with this this little tidbit I found. 1917, this is World War I vintage. And this was their way of promoting, you know, responsible food use, because the country was at war and they wanted to be sure they were taking care of themselves. This is before we started importing the majority of our food. I love the way it says, buy it with thought, cook it with care, use less wheat and meat, buy local foods, serve just enough, use what is left, and don't waste it. And they actually designated meatless, sweetless, and wheatless days, and was promoting that, you know, and using alternatives. The Liberty Gardens, they were called in World War I, they were called Victory Gardens for homeowners to plant their own food in World War II. And so that was, I guess, a good way to promote that to the general public. I know the big verbiage now is that, oh, we're trying to feed the world. And there's a book out here by Peter Simons who was talking about feeding the world. Well, that's a 1940s vintage phrase, because Europe had been devastated by World War II. They couldn't feed themselves. It took American farmers to step up and produce the food that Europe needed to feed themselves for a while. But they didn't need it forever. They just needed it for a while. And so that's something to think about, how much, you know, the Clean Plate Club, this gospel of the clean plate it talks about here. I think some of these are just carryovers from a long time ago. So I guess I'll end with this. It's a good thing. Every doctor will tell you to eat less meat, more fruits and vegetables. Do what you got to do. But it's about our food consolidation system. And that's what worries me. Because even if all of us stopped eating animal protein today, we still got to eat something. And if that something isn't raised responsibly, with the future of the planet in mind, we're going to still have environmental and social justice impacts. I see the fields of corn in Wisconsin that have planted corn on the same field for 15 years in a row. And they just have to keep dumping more and more fertilizer on it to get the corn to grow. Because after a while, the corn has used up all the nutrients it used in the soil, it needs in the soil. So I need more stuff. It's like my soil isn't giving me the food I need, so I need extra supplements. And that's the thing that I worry about. You know, no matter what we grow, if we're not growing it in a responsible way, it's going to still affect our nitrate levels, our phosphorus levels, drinking water, lakes, rivers, our wildlife, our public health and safety. And my indigenous friends remind me that Mother Nature is not a monocropper or a one livestock species. She's diverse with all species interconnected for the survival of the entire ecosystem. I feel as a human species, we've been more obsessed with efficiency instead of building local communities around food. We're enamored with production rather than sustainability. And we've kind of pretended that we humans somehow are islands rather than part of a larger ecosystem.
Yeah. Kim, excuse
Yeah.
me. Yes, we are over time.
Okay.
So, yeah, sorry, I do have to break it up now. I mean,
Sure.
thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Big round of applause for Kim here. Excellent, wonderful information. And because we are over time now, there is no meeting scheduled afterwards, but I have to go and I'm sure other people do as well. We have to go to work tomorrow. So let's see, I will stop recording now. Let's see.